Forget the image most people picture when they hear the words emergency food. The families who made it through the last few years of shortages without panic, without overpaying, and without stripping store shelves were not living on freeze-dried mystery buckets. They were quietly buying ordinary groceries before everyone else noticed what was happening. That matters now because grocery inflation rarely hits all at once. It moves in waves. First the harvest problem, then the processing issue, then the contract reset. And finally, months later, the shelf price jumps and everyone acts surprised. By then, the window has closed. That is exactly why certain households are stocking a very specific group of foods right now. Not glamorous foods, not trendy foods, just practical items with long shelf life, flexible use, and unusually high odds of getting more expensive once old inventory runs out. In some categories, price increases of 25 to 40% are not hard to imagine if supply pressure keeps building. A neighbor of mine, Sarah, started doing this months ago. Nothing extreme, just one or two extra items per trip, chosen carefully. She cut her grocery bill by more than $200 before most people even realized prices were shifting again. Today, we are going through the full list. 11 everyday foods smart families keep buying while they are still boring, still available, and still underpriced. And one of them, number 7, can change a grocery budget more than almost anything else on this list. Start with canned tomato products. Most people see canned tomatoes as a backup ingredient. Something you grab for pasta sauce, then forget until the next recipe calls for it. But budget-conscious households see them very differently. They see one 28-ounce can as a meal starter that can become soup, chili, shakshuka, stew, curry, braising liquid, pizza sauce, salsa base, or a quick skillet dinner stretched with beans and rice. That versatility matters because tomato processing has been under strain. California, which drives a large share of processed tomato production, has dealt with major weather damage. And when harvest losses hit processing plants, the retail effect tends to show up later, not immediately. That delay tricks shoppers. Fresh tomatoes may look normal. The can aisle may still seem calm, but supply contracts are resetting quietly in the background. I recently heard from someone involved in grocery inventory that some suppliers have already warned of tomato product increases in the 30% range. Yet many shelf tags still reflect older costs. That is the opening. Store brands are usually the smart play here. Compare the labels and you will often find the ingredients are nearly identical to the name brand version, just in less glamorous packaging. If a can is 1.89 now and moves to 2.55 later, that sounds minor until you use tomatoes constantly. Buy 20 or 30 cans over time and the savings become real. Keep them in a cool, dark place, and they can hold quality for years. And that is the pattern you will see again and again on this list. Boring item, delayed price signal, then a sudden reset. And if that sounds too simple, the next one is even more underestimated. Peanut butter is one of those products people complain about only after the price has already climbed. By the time a family notices that the jar they used to buy for $8 or $9 is now pushing $12 or $13, the increase feels random. Usually, it is not. Peanut production is heavily concentrated in a few states, especially Georgia and Alabama. When those regions face drought, yields weaken fast. Then processing costs rise on top of that. Energy is more expensive. Packaging is more expensive. Transportation is more expensive. A simple pantry item starts carrying a very complicated cost structure. What makes peanut butter worth watching is not just shelf life, it is efficiency. 2 tablespoons deliver roughly 190 calories and about 8 grams of protein. In plain English, it is one of the cheapest ways to keep affordable, filling energy in the house. When grocery budgets get squeezed, foods that are both dense and flexible become unusually valuable. A lot of families also miss the difference between heavily processed peanut butter and natural peanut butter. Natural versions often have fewer additives, and when stored well, they can hold up beautifully. One practical trick: keep the jar upside down for a few days after bringing it home, then flip it upright. The oils redistribute, and you avoid that irritating layer on top that makes the first few servings feel like a plumbing project. If you can still find a large jar for $8.99, that may look unremarkable now. At 12.99, it suddenly becomes a category people talk about as if it changed overnight. And once basic spreadable protein starts climbing, the next category touches nearly every cooked meal in the house. Cooking oils are easy to ignore because people buy them automatically. A bottle lasts a while, the purchase is infrequent, and the increase rarely makes headlines. But oil has a habit of becoming expensive very quickly when production tightens. Part of the pressure comes from soybean processing and refinery disruptions. Part comes from regulation and the push to divert more vegetable oil into fuel-related uses. That sounds distant from your kitchen, but it is not. If more oil is pulled toward industrial demand, less is left for grocery shelves. Less supply usually means higher prices. This is why experienced planners do not treat all oils as interchangeable. They focus on stability and usefulness. Coconut oil stores well for years if kept properly and is far less fragile than many people assume. Avocado oil has a very high smoke point, around 520 degrees, which makes it one of the more flexible options in a kitchen. Sear with it, roast with it, sauté with it. One bottle can cover a lot of ground. The mistake people make is buying one giant jug because the unit price looks better. That can backfire. Once opened, oil begins a slow decline from air, light, and heat exposure. 3 smaller sealed bottles often outlast one oversized container sitting half-used next to the stove, which, incidentally, is one of the worst places to store any oil. If a $12 bottle turns into an $18 bottle by fall, that is a 50% increase hiding in plain sight. This is where ordinary staples start behaving like luxury items. And few staples are more ordinary than the next one. Pasta looks cheap until you understand what drives it. Shoppers tend to think of pasta as permanently affordable, almost like water or paper towels. But pasta depends on wheat, and wheat prices can swing hard when export regions are unstable, domestic weather turns erratic, or fertilizer and transport costs climb. Once manufacturers run through older grain bought at lower prices, the shelf adjustment can be abrupt. That is why some families have started looking at pasta less like a convenience food and more like low-cost storage. Not every shape is equally useful. Compact shapes like penne, rotini, and shells store more efficiently than long noodles, and they are easier to package into airtight containers. That sounds minor until you are trying to organize months of food in limited space. Whole wheat pasta is worth considering too. It usually has a little more fiber and protein than standard pasta, which means meals stretch with a bit more staying power. Egg noodles are another smart option because they cook faster than many traditional pasta shapes, and when energy costs are high, shorter cook times are not trivial. Restaurant supply stores can be surprisingly good here. Cases that look oversized at first often cost much less per pound than grocery store boxes. And one important warning, learned the unpleasant way by many people: cardboard is not long-term storage. Leave pasta in original boxes too long and pests may eventually treat your pantry like an invitation. Transfer it into sealed containers, keep it dry, and ignore the panic around expiration dates. Dry pasta is usually a quality issue over time, not an instant danger. By now, you are probably noticing a pattern. The smartest savings rarely come from dramatic products. They come from ordinary foods with delayed price signals and strong staying power. So ask yourself this: how many of these do you already buy without thinking about the timing? That question matters, because the next item is one of the oldest forms of food security humans ever figured out. Honey is one of those rare pantry items that almost seems to ignore time. People hear that honey lasts forever and assume it is one of those exaggerated food myths. It is not. Properly stored honey is famously stable, to the point that ancient jars discovered in tombs were still considered edible. Whether you plan to store it for 2 years or 20, that kind of durability changes how you think about value. The problem is that honey production depends on healthy bee populations, and those populations have been under serious stress. Colony losses in recent years have been significant, and whenever bees struggle, honey supply tightens. That may not show up as a dramatic empty shelf at first. More often, it shows up as smaller jars, higher prices, and fewer local options. A beekeeper I know said some small producers are already raising future prices sharply just to stay viable. If that flows through wholesale markets, store prices follow. Honey also does more than sugar. It sweetens, obviously, but raw honey has practical uses people keep rediscovering. A spoonful in tea for a sore throat. A little in marinades or dressings. A stable sweetener that does not demand constant rotation. If it crystallizes, that is usually not spoilage. It is often a sign the honey is genuine. Set the jar in warm water and it returns to liquid. If you are buying for storage, raw and minimally processed tends to be the better choice. It may cost more upfront, but this is one of those categories where paying for the real thing is not just branding, it is function. And once you start thinking in terms of shelf-stable function, the next category becomes hard to ignore. Canned fish is quietly becoming one of the most practical forms of protein in the grocery store. Not glamorous, not cheap-looking enough to attract attention, but very efficient. Fish supply has been pressured by warmer waters, shifting populations, tighter catches, and high fuel costs for fleets. That last piece matters more than most people realize. When the cost of getting a boat out and back doubles, every can eventually reflects it. Most shoppers default to tuna, but the smarter play is usually broader than that. Canned salmon, sardines, mackerel, even herring in some stores. These give you protein that is fully cooked, shelf-stable, and ready without refrigeration. During an outage, that matters. During an exhausting week when nobody wants to cook from scratch, that matters too. Sardines in particular are one of the better values in the aisle. They are rich in omega-3s, high in protein, and because the bones are soft and edible, they also bring calcium. Not a health lecture, just a useful fact. Few foods at that price point do that much. Buying fish packed in water often saves money and gives you more control over flavor later. And larger cans can be surprisingly economical. An $8 can of salmon may provide enough protein for several meals, while fresh salmon at the seafood counter can cost twice as much or more for the same amount. This is one of those categories people often discover too late, right after prices move and right before they start saying, "I should have bought more when it was normal." And if protein is where your grocery bill hurts most, the next item may be the most important one in this entire video. Dried beans and lentils are not exciting, and that is precisely why they are so powerful. They do not have glamorous packaging. Nobody posts photos of a strategic bean purchase. But if your goal is to lower food costs without lowering food security, this category is brutally effective. Legume prices are vulnerable to the same forces that hit grains and oilseeds: drought, export pressure, transportation costs, and disrupted planting seasons. In some markets, futures have already signaled meaningful increases. But even before prices rise, beans and lentils are already one of the strongest value categories in any store. A pound of dried beans for around $2 can deliver the rough protein equivalent of many times that amount in meat. That is why this section can save a family hundreds over a year. Not because beans are magical, because replacing even a portion of expensive meat meals with well-used legumes changes the math. And no, all beans are not the same. Black beans are sturdy, versatile, and store exceptionally well. Red lentils are one of the great convenience foods nobody talks about enough. They cook in about 15 minutes without soaking, which makes them ideal for busy nights or for conserving energy. Chickpeas are another quiet budget weapon. Buy them dried and you can turn a cheap bag into soups, roasted snacks, hummus, curries, and salads for a fraction of the canned or prepared version. For storage, airtight containers are essential. Bay leaves can help discourage pests. And if you really want long-term value, food-grade, buckets with good lids can hold dozens of pounds safely for years. So let me ask the obvious question. How many times in the past month have you paid meat prices for meals that could have been stretched, replaced, or balanced with legumes at 1/4 of the cost? Because once you see that pattern, the next category stops looking old-fashioned and starts looking like leverage. Flour and baking essentials are not just pantry items. Together, they form a system. Most households buy flour occasionally and hope it is there when needed. More strategic households see flour, yeast, baking powder, and baking soda as the basic toolkit for replacing expensive finished products. Bread, pizza dough, pancakes, biscuits, muffins, flatbreads, even homemade pasta. Once you can turn low-cost ingredients into actual meals, your grocery budget becomes far more resilient. This category is also exposed to wheat pressure, fertilizer costs, and global supply disruptions. Wholesale buyers have already been warning that future contracts are much higher than older ones. That means shelf prices can stay deceptively calm until inventory rolls over. Bread flour deserves a quick mention because its higher protein content usually gives better structure for baking, especially for loaves. And yeast is one of the clearest examples of retail markup in the store. Tiny packets feel cheap because each purchase is small, but compare them to a larger vacuum-sealed bag from a restaurant supply store, and the difference is hard to ignore. The same goes for baking powder and baking soda. They are inexpensive, but without them, flour becomes much less useful. Storage here matters almost more than purchase price. Flour left in paper bags is basically trusting your future to cardboard and optimism. Transfer it to airtight containers. Some people freeze flour for 48 hours first to kill any hitchhiking pests, then store it cool and dry. There is also a deeper advantage here. Homemade bread is not just cheaper, it gives a household options. And when prices rise, options are worth money. Which brings us to another category where options matter even more than freshness. Canned meat and shelf-stable protein are no longer fringe emergency items. They are budget shock absorbers. Fresh meat has become one of the most volatile parts of the grocery bill. Cattle numbers have been low, poultry has taken repeated hits from disease outbreaks, and feed costs keep showing up in retail prices. Families feel that first in the meat aisle, usually with a small pause in front of the package and a quiet thought that starts with, "When did this get so expensive?" Canned chicken, canned beef, and salmon or tuna pouches can ease that pressure if you use them strategically. A can of chicken for $3.50 might not look cheap until you compare it to the fresh equivalent. Suddenly, it is not emergency food. It is value. The same goes for canned beef used in chili, tacos, or pasta sauce. It is already cooked, shelf-stable, and available when the freezer is not. That last point matters more than many people expect. During outages or storms, fully cooked protein becomes incredibly valuable. Families who keep a modest rotation of canned meat are not scrambling to eat around spoilage or worrying about a grill in bad weather. They simply open dinner. A practical tip: rotate stock every few months, not because it will spoil tomorrow, but because quality and taste are better when your pantry works like a cycle instead of a museum. And if sodium or canned flavor bothers you, a quick rinse before using often improves the result. This is where preparedness stops being theoretical. It becomes Tuesday night convenience and storm season insurance at the same time. And the next item may be even more useful because it helps food last longer in the first place. Vinegar is one of the least appreciated forms of grocery insurance. Most people think of it as something for salad dressing, maybe a cleaning hack, maybe that bottle in the back of the pantry nobody remembers buying. But vinegar is more useful than that. It is stable, inexpensive, and tied to one of the oldest money-saving habits there is: preserving food before it goes bad. Production costs for acetic acid and related inputs have been under pressure from energy and manufacturing disruption, which means even vinegar is not immune to price increases. A 25% jump would not be shocking. And because it is not a flashy product, many shoppers would not notice until they needed it. White vinegar is the workhorse. Cleaning, deodorizing, pickling, produce washing, descaling, emergency household use. Apple cider vinegar is often more expensive, but many households like it for food preservation and a few simple home uses. The larger lesson is that vinegar can help extend the life of other groceries. That means it saves money twice, once on the purchase, and again by reducing waste. Quick pickling is the easiest example. Cucumbers getting soft, onions piling up, carrots lingering too long, all can be turned into something useful instead of something you throw away with mild guilt and no witnesses. That alone can save a surprising amount over a year. Keep vinegar in its original container, stored reasonably cool, and you have an item that may outlast half the rest of the pantry. And once you start preserving food, The final category becomes the quiet backbone of everything else. Salt and spices do not look like savings when you buy them. They look like extras. That is the illusion. In reality, salt and spices are what make inexpensive staple foods sustainable over time. Rice and beans without seasoning become a punishment. With the right salt, garlic, onion, cumin, chili, paprika, or herbs, they become dinner people will actually eat again. That matters because the most affordable food in the world is still expensive if your family gets tired of it and orders takeout instead. This category is also more fragile than it seems. Spice crops are vulnerable to storms, drought, labor shortages, and very expensive shipping. Because spices are light and high value, freight costs can distort final prices fast. Vanilla is a classic example, but it reaches far beyond vanilla. Sea salt or kosher salt is worth keeping in quantity because salt is not just flavor, it is preservation. It helps in brining, curing, fermenting, and basic food prep. It also effectively does not expire. Garlic powder and onion powder deserve a special mention because they can rescue plain meals in seconds and last far longer than fresh versions. Whole spices tend to hold potency longer than ground ones, which is useful if you store them carefully in cool, dark conditions. And if you have ever compared grocery store spice jars to bulk bags from an ethnic market or restaurant supplier, you already know the markup can be absurd. What costs $4 in a tiny bottle may cost $8 in a bag several times the size. That is the final pattern on this list. The families who spend less over time are not always buying less food. Often, they are buying smarter forms of the same food at calmer moments from better sources before retail catches up. And that is really the point of all 11 items. This is not about fear. It is about timing. Price spikes feel chaotic when you meet them at the shelf with no plan. They feel much smaller when your pantry already contains the basics that matter most. Canned tomatoes, peanut butter, oils, pasta, honey, canned fish, beans and lentils, flour and baking supplies, canned proteins, vinegar, salt and spices. None of them are dramatic on their own. Together, they form a quiet system of protection. If you build that system gradually, 1 or 2 items per trip, the cost stays manageable. You avoid panic buying, you avoid waste, and you give yourself something many shoppers lose during inflationary periods: the ability to choose. Because in the end, the most expensive grocery habit is waiting until everybody else finally notices. If this helped you think differently about your pantry and your spending, consider subscribing. And next time you shop, pay attention to the boring aisle. That is usually where the smartest money is hiding.